Mississippi is a paradox in many, many ways. We sometimes have been our own worst enemy, oftentimes have been our own worst enemy. And looking at our history, you can find several reasons why that is the case. I'm going to talk today about politics in Mississippi, going back to the beginning. Mississippi was a large territory in the South as the nation began to be settled. The Mississippi Delta is a vast region in the western part of the state along the Mississippi River. We're talking about an area of land that for centuries and centuries was flooded, and with those floods came very rich silt from the Mississippi River, and it formed rich farmland. It was an excellent target for those that were moving into the state and wanting to make a living from the soil. I'll mention that first because I'm going to mention other sections. I don't want to get ahead of myself by saying that because of the huge thousands and thousands of acres of land in the Mississippi Delta, it made absolute to the settlers that came. They needed labor for the land, and slavery flooded into the state of Mississippi. We think of the United States as being settled from east to west. Mississippi is a state of paradoxes. Mississippi began being settled from the south, from the New Orleans area, where people with significant means came up the river for 2 natchez. I don't want to leave out the Native Americans that populated the state of Choctaw and others at the time that Mississippi was settled. As the settlers came up the river for 2 natchez, the state had gathered enough people that by 1817 the state was becoming populated enough that it was time for Mississippi to attempt to be admitted to the Union. Constitution was written on the outskirts of what is now Natchez that would enable the state of Mississippi to be admitted into the Union. And that Constitution, as you might expect, was very much one written for the elites, white males of means that were interested mainly in making money off of the fledgling state of Mississippi once it entered the Union. But already at that time, spreading from Natchez across to the east were a number of different settlers who were not of similar means to those who came to line their pockets with what they thought were huge economic opportunities. And so as those settlers began drifting across the bottom third of the state, across an area that bears the label of the Piney Woods area. And this was decidedly a different area from what the Delta and along the river counties represented. These were the type of settlers who went over and found acres, carried with them a little bit of livestock, built a house for shelter, and were very hard scrabble types across the Piney Woods. This area figured very prominently in the politics of the state. As we moved on from 1817, this was the period of the rise of the national populist Andrew Jackson, one who took the side of the common man, and a great deal of resentment against the elites. As we approached the 1830s, Mississippians who were populating the state wanted their piece of the political pie. And by 1832, a new constitution was in order. No longer did you have to own property to be able to vote. The capital of the state was established in Jackson, Mississippi, and named after Andrew Jackson. As we reached the time of the Civil War, it should be noted that by that time, 55% of the human beings in the state of Mississippi were slaves, and that would tend to grow as we got to the Civil War and passed through the Civil War. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was a watershed moment in the state of Mississippi. Even if it didn't have immediate impact, the conclusion of the war would demonstrate that it did. It should be noted that leading up to the war, Mississippi was one of the wealthiest states in the Union based on the cash crop of cotton. Once the war was concluded and the South lost, Mississippi plummeted to last on the list of states in wealth and hardly knew where to turn. And it began a period of the powers that be in the state trying to find a way to reestablish a system of labor that would propel the economy forward under new circumstances. The Reconstructionists took over the state because Mississippi had not been readmitted to the Union then, and in fact, federal troops were sent back in by the national government, many never left, that enabled the Reconstructionists to put together a new Constitution in 1869, and it was a different world. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, known as the Civil War Amendments, abolished slavery, said no state can deny citizenship rights, and the 15th Amendment gave the former slaves a right to vote. But then the tide would turn. In 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes made a deal with the South to pull the federal troops out of the South, and you will be on your own. You can go and basically make the laws that you want to make, and that's all the South needed to hear. And the heyday of the Reconstructionists gave way to the Redeemer period. It cannot be overstated. The terror, so to speak, in the minds of white Mississippians as they looked at a situation where a significant black majority were left that way, and all African Americans were given the right to vote, that Mississippi would most assuredly have a black governor, and task before them was to find a way to make sure that these newly enfranchised African Americans would no longer have access to the ballot box. They sat down in 1890 to write a new Constitution. I often refer to it as the Redeemer Constitution, that would set in motion laws and possibilities of disenfranchising black voters, but in also creating a Constitution that would, in its structure, minimize the power that any black elected official, were he to be elected, ill-designed, designed for all the wrong reasons, 1890 Constitution is still the Constitution that exists today. But it immediately started having an impact. But times have changed, and political correctness have watered down the harsh rhetoric that if you went back and looked at newspapers of the day, you would be amazed at some of the things that were said, and almost had to be said if you were a white and you were a Democrat attempting to achieve elective office.